Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Justin Essery. I'm an associate professor at Wake Forest University. Welcome to the International Methods Colloquium. The IMC is a weekly, online, interactive seminar discussion on the application of quantitative statistical methodology to the social sciences, sponsored by Wake Forest University and by Springer Publishing. This week's speaker is Zoe Nemerever of the University of California, San Diego, giving a talk entitled Measuring the Rural Continuum in Political Science. Zoe's talk will last between 30 and 40 minutes, after which point we will take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button at the bottom of your webinar window at any time. We are going to hold questions toward the end of the talk. If you wish to be recognized and ask your question via your microphone, via audio, just indicate that in the text box when you ask your question. Otherwise, I will read your question aloud during the Q&A period. A link to Zoe's paper and her slides will be available in the Zoom webinar chat window, and you may refer to it throughout the presentation. Now I'd like to welcome Zoe Nemerever to the IMC. Welcome, Zoe.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. Today, I'm going to be presenting a paper written with my co-author, Melissa Rogers at Claremont Graduate University. This is a measurement paper that has been accepted at Political Analysis, and I'm really looking forward to talking about measuring political geography in American politics with you all today. So, first of all, what this paper is not is a one-size-fits-all way of measuring rural and American politics. In fact, that is the exact opposite of the point that we're going to make. This paper is more so how to engage with other scholars in a discussion of how we're measuring geography in our empirical work and the implications it has not only for our own findings, but for being able to relate findings from one paper to another. In this paper, we discuss challenges to studying rural populations. We show that measurement and our measurement choices affect knowledge and our takeaways from our empirical studies. We replicate other authors' work. Today, I'll be discussing 3 of our replication projects, but there's more in the online appendix if you're interested. And finally, we'll be presenting resources for how political scientists can best capture their concept of rurality or urbanness. And a large part of this is presenting our new data set, State Legislative Districts Urban-Rural Data Set. So to begin, just like most topics in political science, there's a lot of challenges to precisely measuring the concept we're interested in. The first challenge is choosing a unit of aggregation that will reduce measurement error, so be as precise as possible without limiting potential data sources to the extent that we can no longer study what we're interested in. Especially for folks who do observational work, such as myself, we're often limited by the data that is available to us. And then the second challenge for studying rural populations is choosing a measurement schema that accurately accounts for the theoretical notion of rurality that's intended by the authors. Part of this involves the authors communicating to the reader and thinking through why rurality or urbanness or suburbanness is included in the analysis and what function theoretically it is serving. And another part is connecting that theoretical notion of rurality to a correct or as best as possible classification schema. First, I'm going to discuss choosing a unit of aggregation. So the status quo for many studies in American politics is county because it has a plethora of data available at this level. It's manageable, and those are huge pluses that allow us to answer questions that we're interested in. So county definitely has the advantage in that regard. However, there are disadvantages to using county. One of the most prominent ones being that, is it a political or geographic unit, right? And this is important for questions that involve politics. And this depends on the state. Different states have different functions of their counties. In some states, it is just a geographical area. It's just a border. In other states, they are huge local governments that distribute public programs, that provide law enforcement. And so when using counties across the states, it's important to keep into mind that a county means different things to different state residents. Second, counties are very large with a very large variance in their population size. The average size of a county is about 100,000 people, but the standard deviation of that average is 300,000. So counties are very heterogeneous in their size and, of course, their homogeneity across the states, which can present problems for measurement. One specifically being is that because counties are so large, you often have misclassification. Specific to rural politics, 1/5 of rural Americans live in metro counties. And so that means when you use county level classification as metro or non-metro, you're misclassifying 20% of rural Americans. And this can create issues in the conclusions that we draw. So if the status quo is county, well, what are other options available to us if we're interested in researching rural politics? So one option is to use zip codes or zip code tabulated areas. You could also use census tracts and blocks. One issue that these units of measurement raise is that even though they are much more smaller and precise than counties, it's more difficult to find data on the variables we're interested in at these levels of aggregation, and this can create a challenge. Of course, using systems such as GIS, you can connect the two different your variables across different levels of aggregation, but these are for those of you using the census data, you can often find ZCT, zip code tabulated areas, and census tract demographic information. You can also use legislative districts, whether this is federal or state legislative districts. For many questions in political science, this is the natural unit of analysis. And in our work today, we're going to be presenting a new data set on state legislative districts that presents rural classification data that is an improvement on what's currently available on the census website. And then finally, voting precincts is another unit of analysis that is much more precise than county, but still has limited data availability. What is perhaps more puzzling is choosing a classification schema that accurately portrays the notion of rural that the research necessitates. And so often people will use single factor classification. So this can be the population size, maybe it's of a city, of a county. Population density is another one. This is just, often people per square mile, how spread out people are. Or classifications as metro versus non-metro. And so metro versus non-metro is isolating metropolitan populations and then clumping together everything that's not metro. So suburban, exurban, small town, rural. This is useful for studying metro populations because you can isolate them, but not useful for studying rural populations or small town or exurban populations, right? Metropolitan and non-metropolitan can really be thought of as urban and not urban. And when we conflate non-metropolitan with rural, our conclusions can be misleading, which we'll show later on in the presentation. And so choosing a classification schema really depends on what question you're answering. And there are more nuanced classification schemas available than these single factor classifications that you would find in the census or other common sources of data. And so 4 holistic schemas that we discuss in our paper are rural-urban continuum codes, urban influence codes, rural-urban commuting areas, and then the metro non-metro classification for comparison. And here you can see the different factors that go into each of these classifications. So they all involve population size. The rural-urban continuum codes and urban influence codes include adjacency to a metro area, which can be very important. For example, sometimes suburbs are small municipalities, 10,000 people, 15,000 people, but they're right on the edge of a large metropolitan city. They just have a small municipality population despite being de facto integrated with a large city, and this could affect people's access to economic opportunity, educational, healthcare resources, which might in turn affect their political experiences. And so it's important to differentiate, a town of 15,000 on the edge of Seattle, Washington is very different than a town of 15,000 that's over in Eastern Washington. Relatedly, commuting population is another factor that goes into all 3 of these holistic schemas. Commuting population is how much of that population commutes to a different economic center. And this could be a larger economic center, an economic center of equal size. There's different ways that it's delineated in these schemas, but this is especially important for thinking about people's lived and experienced communities rather than just, for example, the zip code that their house is located in. But if we're thinking anything about political behavior or attitudes, we want to be sure to capture not just their residence location, but also their location where they have other formative experiences, which might include which city they work in. And so this is what the rural-urban commuting area code looks like. It has 10 categories, with 1 being the most urban and 10 being the least urban or most rural. On the right-hand side of the table is the percent of the US population that resides in each category. It looks like, well, it's true that not much of the US population resides in the higher categories. For example, 1% is a RUCA category 10, but I'm a state politics person, and when you disaggregate this by state, some states do have very sizable populations in the rural areas, so don't be misled. And so what's especially advantageous about this holistic schema is the commuting flow is disaggregated by the size of the urban center or small town that the community is commuting to. So for example, RECA code 6 has a primary commuting flow to a large urban cluster, whereas the next most rural commuting code of category 7 is primary flow to an urban cluster no greater than 10,000. And so those can be very different types of communities. And so being able to distinguish between those two is a huge advantage. These RECA codes are available at the census tract level from the census, but what is especially relevant is the University of Washington Public Health School has put the RECA codes onto zip codes, which can be very useful, especially for folks who use survey data in American politics, such as, the CCES has zip code. So you're not often going to be able to identify, or hardly ever be able to identify, your survey respondent to their census tract level, but being able to have a zip code RECA classification is a huge advantage over just using some county classification that's less precise and not available at in the RUCA schema. This is a density plot of the CCES population, a commonly studied population in American politics, and it shows the density of RUCA codes at the zip code tabulation area level for metro and non-metro counties. So looking at the top line of the figure, we can see that metro counties contain mostly folks who live in a RUCA code 1, a much smaller amount that live in a RUCA code 2, and then almost negligible amounts of higher RUCA codes are captured when we look at metro counties. However, when we look at non-metro counties, we see that they still contain a significant amount of folks who are in the top two most urban RUCA codes, and that it also lumps together, folks who live in an area 4 with an area 10. And if we go back to our figures, that's putting together micropolitan area cores with rural areas. And so when we're using county level codes or the metro non-metro delineation, it's important to think through is putting groups together, such as people from the most rural group at group 10 with group 4, or the number of folks who are in group 1 in the same category. Is that capturing whatever geographic control or independent variable that our theory calls for? And then when we look at counties in a more sophisticated way, so now we're looking at counties by the rural urban continuum code, not just metro non-metro, we can see that it is much better in terms of the homogeneity within each county of the different types of RUCA codes across the bottom. However, there's still quite a bit of mixed populations. So for example, in metro non-adjacent, which is the third line, we have, almost equal parts RUCA category 4 and RUCA category 7. And so being conscientious that if you're going to use county level measurements, that it's going to be putting different types of populations into the same group. And if you're studying political geography, this could be especially confounding. And so now we're going to talk about some applications of these measurements to illustrate why it is important and what we can learn from employing new measurements of rurality in American politics. And so we replicated Flavin and Franco's recent political behavior article on economic segregation and unequal policy responsiveness. They are measuring representation, looking at survey respondents' preferences on bills in Congress, and then how those legislators voted on the bills with respect to their constituents' preferences. The independent variable they look at is economic segregation at the zip code level. And they employ rurality as a control in their analysis. They control for it using rural zip code tabulation areas as ones that are not within an urban area or urban cluster as defined by the US Census. And so an urbanized area is an area of 50,000 or more people, and an urban cluster is at least 2,500 people, but less than 50,000. And so problematically, this definition conflates rural with non-urban. And so one example of this is in North Carolina, there's a town called Wilson's Mill. It is in their analysis coded as rural because it has a population of 2,400. However, this municipality is only 30 miles from Raleigh, which is the second largest city in North Carolina, and has 500,000 residents, significant economic activity. And it's not like there's rural area in those 30 minutes between Wilson's Mill and Raleigh. It is continuous, sprawling suburbs. And so for this to be counted as rural might make it difficult to connect this study of rural politics to studies that use other conceptualizations of rural, such as, like Kathy Kramer's work or work on rural counties in the West. And so we substitute a different measurement. They have their original binary rural measurement. And this is their main variable of interest, the rich insulation index. When we substitute in a new binary measure of rural using the RUCA codes binned into two categories, we see that 0 is now inside the 95% confidence interval for their main variable of interest. When we use a categorical rural variable, so this is the RUCA code keeping it in the 10 categories, not bothering to condense it into rural versus non-rural, right? Because perhaps it wasn't a control so much about rural America as it was a control variable just for the geographic characteristics of that zip code. We see that the estimate is much more precise for the geographic control when we don't perhaps arbitrarily decide that it has to be rural or non-rural or urban versus non-urban, but when we can control for a range of geographic settings. And just like the other replication, we now see that 0 is inside the confidence interval as well, although we can't be confident that these are different from each other because of the overlapping confidence intervals. But this is important because, for example, in one part of their paper, they say living in rural parts of the county and residing in areas with higher levels of income inequality both lead to better representation. However, these new findings from our substituted measures show that we should be more hesitant to draw conclusions about representation for rural areas based just on this binary rural indicator of being an urban area, urban cluster, and to draw a conclusion that about rural representation based on urban and non-urban categories is problematic by combining, suburban, exurban, small town, and rural areas together. The data set that this paper introduces is called the State Legislative Districts Urban Rural Data Set. And so measuring the urban rural spectrum at the state legislative district level, the go-to measure is percent urban, which is provided by the US Census. This is problematic for reasons we've discussed. So we use the Missouri Census Data Center's GeoCore program to match census tract level RUCA codes onto corresponding state legislative districts. We use 3 different methods for assigning that 10 category RUCA code to state legislative districts. The first is probability based assignment. We probabilistically assigned RUCA codes to state legislative districts based on the proportion of the district belonging to each of the 10 RUCA categories. Another way we did it is plurality. So what is the plurality RUCA code for that state legislative district? And then finally, we did weighted average, even though there are obvious issues with using a weighted average for a categorical variable. Sometimes in political science, it is done anyways. So we included that. These are the correlations between the 3 different types of measurement for state legislative districts. The plurality measure, we reckon, is not precise enough for most statistical analyses, but is good for descriptive work if you're trying to say what the modal geographic community is within a state legislative district. Now I'm going to show you a few just diagnostics about this data set. So this shows the density of legislative districts according to how many census tracts are in each district. And so we can see the light gray density curve is the lower chamber of states, and then the dark gray is the upper chamber of state legislatures. We can see that, you know, most of the state legislative districts have between 0 and 50 census tracts, and then a few have much higher numbers. And this data is available by state legislative district in the data set if folks wish to control for it. In regards to missingness at the district level, this table shows the years of missing data for particular districts. So 6,500 of the districts don't have any years of missing data. Our data spans 2007 to 2016, I believe. And so we can see that some districts do have, 2 years or so missing in the data set. How we've dealt with this in research that has used this data set is to substitute other years that are the years that are closest that have data available. And then in regards to missingness within district, this table shows the percent of district population that's included in the coverage. Census tracts are not all coded at the RUCA code level. The census isn't able to code or get the data necessary to code some of those RUCA tracts for whatever level. Things like commuting data can be especially tricky to collect for more remote or smaller census tracts. And so we see that the large majority of districts across the different years have more than 90% of the population included, which is very promising. If folks were hesitant about, districts where we could only collect 60 to 69% of the zip code, the census tract population, they could exclude those from their study based on a threshold of completeness that they find appropriate. So we used this data set to replicate Brockman's 2013 field experiment on representation of Black interests. And the unit of analysis is a state legislative district. The field experiment was on state legislators. And so when we substituted our state legislative district data, we found that the main results were strengthened with more precise geographic control. So this replication exercise is definitely not to say that when we put in our measure, we debunk other folks' findings. This is to say that when we provide a different measurement, we can have new insights. And in this case, the new insight was we should be even more confident that Black politicians are motivated to represent Black interests. And then we also have some of their other independent variables get greater significance, like the Squire Professionalism Index, the control variable for Southern states. And so those might bring in new findings of interest that provide us a more complete picture of the research question and the phenomenon being studied when we substitute in a more holistic or precise geographic control. And then finally, and perhaps one of the most important findings from this paper is that an important theoretical hurdle is rurality something that you manifest? Is it a consciousness, a rural consciousness like we read about in Kathy Kramer's work? Or is it a location, right? Does it just where you live, or can you have this rural political or personal identity regardless of where you live? And this can be very important for what we are thinking about when we talk about things such as the urban-rural divide. Is it the divide between folks who live in this area versus this area? Or is it the divide between folks who say they're rural and folks who identify with urban areas? And so we used Mumolo and Nall's survey data from their 2016 paper. They asked respondents to describe the area or the neighborhood that they live in now. And their survey also had respondent zip codes. And so we were able to compare folks' self-reported neighborhood description with what objective measurements would say about their zip code. And so the options that survey respondents had was, city downtown, city in a neighborhood, suburb, small town, rural area on a farm, and rural area not on a farm. And so this is just a representation of all the folks who identified as rural in their survey. When we look at the people who actually live in a zip code that would be objectively classified as rural using the holistic RUCA codes, we see that only, a handful at best actually live in rural areas. So this suggests that there is a mismatch between what folks consider to be rural in their identity and what government's schemas would have us believe is rural location in the United States. However, we can be a little bit more lenient with our measurement and include small towns. I think that's a very reasonable thing to include in rural. But here we still see that, about a third of the respondents who say they're rural actually live in a rural or small town area, which is very puzzling. And if we add suburbs, we now have accounted for half of the people who say they are rural. So on the flip side, this means half of the people who reported themselves as living in a rural area live in an area that is more urban than a suburb. So a city, essentially. And so rural identity is matching on to rural location with approximately the precision of a coin flip. So this necessitates that we think carefully about when we're talking about rural politics or the urban-rural divide or geographic polarization. What are we specifying, especially if we're asking people to self-identify or if we're imposing place identity onto folks based on where they reside, being conscientious that identity and location don't match up as precise as exactly as one might think. And so the implications of this is rural people, defined as people who say they are rural, live in all sorts of neighborhoods. And this is interesting and definitely begs more research questions to look at, if there's any sorts of patterns or proclivities of folks who say they're rural while living in a metro or suburban area. And also, is the urban-rural divide psychological or physical, right? And so these are measurement decisions and conceptualization decisions that we cannot take for granted when talking about rural politics in our research. Is important to clarify, what are we using the word rural to represent? Is it our people who identify with rural areas and rural ethos, or is it, an institutional divide in where districts are drawn? And so to summarize from our replication and extension projects, we show that results differ depending on how you operationalize rural. In the best case scenarios, more precise geographic controls lead to more precise estimates on the main independent variables and can give us more confidence in our findings. And that rural self-identification is not the same as rural location. And this is something that could definitely be explored more in political science and at the very least specified in research, whether you're using an identity conceptualization of rurality or a geographic conceptualization of rurality. The takeaways from this paper is that, perfect measurement is elusive. We don't have the answer to what is best to use in every scenario, but there are practical steps for improvement. And, one of those is really specifying in the writing of an article why the geographic control is being included, what theoretical purpose it is serving, and stating how you measure it so that other researchers can make sure that they're able to relate their findings to yours in an accurate way, and reading through articles to possibly replicate for our paper, we found that often there was no explanation of how rural was measured, and this is problematic for not only for replication purposes, but also for being able to connect findings from one study to another. So one way to improve measurement is to strive for units smaller than county, unless the unit of, or unless the phenomenon of interest is something like, a county legislature or a county sheriff really trying to decide if county is the accurate or best unit of analysis, and figuring out possibly how to get the data we are interested in at smaller units. And then to thoughtfully operationalize. For example, if you want to know about the urban-rural divide and Trump support, perhaps you are operationalizing a rural identity, which needs to be asked with the survey question. If you are studying access to healthcare, then rural identity is probably not the best operationalization. It would be something like distance to a hospital. And these are all measures, that can be found. The public health literature has done a great job of measuring different types of access to healthcare and emergency services. So if you're studying something about public programs or public services, then perhaps geography is the best way to go rather than identity. And so not conflating rural with non-urban, right? There are many variations on this spectrum. And then giving rural a purpose, it's not just a control variable. It should be controlling, for a possible confounder. And what is that confounder, and why do we think it relates to geography or place identity? And so thank you for your attention. I look forward to discussing this research and measurement with you.
All right, thank you, Zoe, for that presentation. At this point, Zoe Nemerever is available to take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of your webinar window. If you wish to be recognized and ask your question via audio, please indicate this in the Q&A text box. Otherwise, I will read your question. And we've already had a few questions come in, so I'm going to go ahead and pick one that I also wrote down as being important. So at the end of your talk, you talk a lot about how it's important to have a conceptual notion of what you mean by rural before you try to measure it and put it into your model or whatever you're doing. I am curious to know what you think are the sort of operationally meaningful definitions, because if it means everything, then it means nothing, right? So it has to have some sort of well-defined idea if we're going to actually, for example, falsify theories with tests using that measure, right? If it can just adapt to anything, then it's not a real it's not a real useful concept. So what do you think rurality is?
Correct. And so that's a good question. I like how you phrased it, that if it can mean anything, then it means nothing. And maybe what would be best for empirical research is moving away from the word rurality when we don't mean just that. So a good example I can think of is research by Jim Gimple, Reeves, Moy, and Levin on individual attitudes. And they look at rurality and they specify distance to a large city. And then they go on to explain that for them, distance to a large city is serving the purpose of representing how often folks may come in to contact with a large, diverse, heterogeneous group of people. And so that is one way with, they weren't saying rurality as, oh, people in rural areas tend to be more socially conservative, or they tend to have such and such demographics or such and such economic status. They were saying what we really mean when we use the word rural in our title is we mean distance from a city, because cities have the quality that you're going to be exposed to all different types of lifestyles and belief systems. Another way is population density, for example. And, in some of my work, my political behavior article, I'm really concerned with the size of counties and sizes or counties that are very sparsely populated. And they're saying things like population density or physical county size can better capture that. I think using rurality, as a coefficient label in a regression table is fine. So as long as in the text we're saying, what we really mean by this is how closely people together live so they can be canvassed by, political campaigners, or how far they are from a city with a major hospital, or what access to schools that they have. And there's not necessarily, and so perhaps just choosing a more narrow conceptualization of rural and then wording the variable accordingly would help avoid the problem that you're saying of saying it means everything.
Yeah, it sounds like you're actually advocating for not using that term, but instead using more specific measures that are more narrowly tailored. And actually, let me follow up because, now there's a lot of mobility in the United States, usually related to working, right? People have to move around to find jobs and what have you. So if, for example, you're raised, I'll give you a real life example. My father was raised on a farm outside of Bristow, Indiana. Bristow is a quote unquote town that is composed of about 5 houses and a feed mill. So that's about as rural as you can get. On the other hand, he joined the Navy and has spent most of his adult life living in cities and now lives in Norfolk, Virginia, which is by any accounts a large urban area. But by some definitions, he might still be considered a rural person because, in terms of identity, self-identification, in terms of culture or whatever you might want to say, he still has some of the characteristics of that upbringing. And if that's what we're getting at, how does geography factor into that? Because you can have people who are living in, exurban areas or even suburban areas who really strongly identify with the culture that we would call rural.
Yes, well, perhaps in that case, geography doesn't factor in that. He would need to be asked on a survey question to self-identify, right? Especially because mobility is on the rise. Just looking at somebody's zip code at the time they happen to take whatever survey would miss out on a more well-rounded view of what types of places they have lived in. I mean, location would be good for studying, for example, access to a power grid, right? Like that's a particularly salient example this week. Like it doesn't matter if you have a rural identity or not for you to have access to something that has geographic containment. Or if you're looking at something like vaccine rollout in urban versus rural areas, that is unrelated to identity. But really I think when we are studying the urban rural divide, we need to think about, is this something that we can be studying with geographic measures, or do we need to start moving towards more self-identification like we do for other types of demographic groups?
We have a lot of questions, so I want to make sure to get to all of them I can. I'm going to start with a couple that came in early that are more clarifying. So how frequently, this is from Harold Woolman, how frequently are RUCA data available and how far back are they available for in time, I assume?
Yeah, so they're available to 1990. The census is every 10 years. So 1990, 2000, 2010, and 2020 eventually. For the zip code level done by the University of Washington Public Health School, it is less available. I think it's like 2000 forward. And so there's definitely limitations for folks who do long time series, and that's understandable.
So decennially from the
Yeah.
census, so you're going to have to interpolate or do something.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And also, sort of a related question from Andrea Busby. Do you have a source for 1/5 of rural residents living in metro counties? It is very relevant to some of my work.
Yes, we just looked at census data.
Okay.
It's in the replication files for our paper, which will hopefully get through page proof soon. And but you can email me in the meantime, Andrea.
Brian Schaffner says, first of all, thanks for the great talk. The work you've done is a great resource for so many of us. Based on your work, do you think it is valuable for surveys to include a question asking respondents to identify whether they live in an urban, suburban, or rural area, or is that too conflated with other political factors it might be meant to explain, so that it might actually cause some inferential problems? For example, leading us to overstate the urban-rural divide in vote choice. Would it be better for us to exclude such a question and leave it to researchers to define where people live using geocodes? And I actually want to add a little addendum to that. If you use legislative districts, those have, of course, been chosen, right? And they've been chosen presumably to maximize somebody's chances or some party's chances of winning election. So you might have a similar kind of self-fulfilling prophecy there, too.
Right. And that would like be, yeah. And it's different by each state because some states have like more pro gerrymandering procedures than others, and so you
Right.
really do get not inorganic legislative districts. So it would be great to know more about which types of people or people with what co-characteristics are more likely to identify, as rural when they live in an urban area. And this is ongoing research. Thinking about Brian's question, I mean, there are still a lot of unknowns at this point. I think urban, suburban, rural is, one way to ask it, but it would be really interesting to have it be open-ended and see what people put in. Mumolo and Null, they did different types of metro, different types of suburban, and then small town and rural. So they provided a lot of different options rather than just the three. I think in terms of potentially overstating the urban-rural divide, well, if it's a divide between urban and rural identity, then we're not overstating it if we just specify the divide between people who identify as rural and people who identify as urban, but being sure to, not conflate those two. If you're going to measure the urban-rural divide based on folks' identities, making that very upfront and differentiating it from other studies that use people's actual location, because the divide between urban and rural identity, I think, is very interesting and very important and salient to contemporary politics and is something worth studying, even though it is not the same as the literal or objective urban-rural divide. I think they're both have great potential explanatory power for a lot of salient political questions.
Thomas B. asks, definition and measurement are important issues. I hope everyone watching this broadcast agrees with that. What about methodology? For example, how would you integrate these disparate data inputs into a classifying model?
That is a great question. We haven't had time to think about that. It's not in the paper, but if you send me an email, I'll get back to you on that. I want to make sure I can think it through fully.
I mean, one way you could go forward with that is to, if being rural is a constructed identity, you could think of modeling it, right?
Yeah.
It could be a model product, not a model input. So Julio Ascaruns, boy, I bet I butchered that last name. Sorry, Julio. He asks, to what extent can your concept and measurement be used for comparative research? And I assume he means comparative country research.
Yeah, so that is useful feedback that we've gotten, that, this should not just be done for American politics. This should be done for other countries as well. However, like my specialization is American politics, and I didn't think I could do it justice to include other countries. I think a lot of these same concepts apply about, units of aggregation and types of schemas. It just would be dependent on what that country collects in terms of data. I'm only familiar with the United States Census, but a lot of the concepts we talk about in our paper, such as identity versus location, or access to public services, or how much exposure you have to people of different cultures, would apply to other countries as well. And there is research that has been done recently on the urban-rural divide in European countries that has been using thoughtful measurements of geography. And so that's definitely something I'm interested in learning more about if you do think more about measurement comparatively.
Jess Esplin asks, or first says, thank you for presenting this fascinating research. I thought the delineation between objective rural measures and psychological identification was particularly important. I wonder if there may also be historical effects or potential lag of rural versus urban self-identification that may occur after rapid urbanization. For example, many people in suburban areas in Utah and Idaho seem to have a sense of rural identification as a result of their family history or their area's historical ruralness. Is this something you've considered, and how might you take historical ruralness into account? And I'll just add on to that, there are also small cities that are sort of surrounded essentially by rural areas. Winston-Salem, you could argue, is a bit like that. I think that's a related question, right? If you're a city surrounded by pretty rural areas, you might find people in that city identifying as rural, even though it's obviously a city. So, how might you take the historical ruralness, or maybe this network or location effect into account?
So, in regards to the location effect, using the 10 categories of the RECA codes will allow you to get areas like Winston-Salem that do have, like a small population size and aren't fully commuting into Raleigh, for example. And so that's the great thing about the RECA codes, is you don't have to necessarily lump together a town the size of Winston-Salem surrounded by rural areas with a town the size of Winston-Salem that's adjacent to a larger town. In regards to historical trajectories of identification, that is a really good question and a tricky one to answer, I guess, because of how recent the data is, and not, having like panel data tracking how people's identity change as they move or change through generations. Like, for example, do we inherit our geographic identity the same way we inherit our partisan affiliation? And that is a very interesting question. I think one that should be researched. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I don't have an answer. I wish I did.
Well, looks like we've exhausted the questions, so I'm going to thank Zoe for being our presenter this week. I want to remind everyone that this presentation will be posted to our website shortly after this broadcast if you'd like to watch it again or share it with a colleague. I also want to invite you to join us on Friday, February 26th next week, when we will host a talk by Shuei Jin of the University of Massachusetts, Boston, giving a talk entitled "When Public Opinion Wins, the Big U-Turn in Propaganda of Human Gene Editing in China." Please see our website, www.methods-colloquium.com, to get more information about this talk. We had one more question come in. Oh, it just says, "Thank you so much." I wanted to give you a chance to answer it if it was a question. Well, I will repeat that sentiment. Zoe, thank you very much for being here today.